after the sanction, this new round being announced, okay, where is the ball? The ball is in whose court? Let's go to Mr. Pollack.
Well, good evening, Chen Wei. I think we need to be very, very careful about the terminology we use. When we use the term negotiation, that presumes that we're going back into some kind of a formal process with North Korea, whether bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, or whatever, and we're not at that point. The issue here is whether or not some kind of contact is possible. In fact, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, of course, just met with Lee Young-ho, his counterpart from North Korea, in Manila. And that may be more the operative question, but what is significant, obviously, is that there is an effort here to get unanimous consent. Still a lot to be determined, but things that impose real costs on Pyongyang if they are if the sanctions are fully implemented.
We do see interactions among the foreign ministers. Professor Sung, Professor Lee rather, there is North Korea, South Korea foreign ministers even, and of course Chinese and North Koreans, not to mention South Koreans and the United States. But will these interactions eventually lead to what Mr. Pollack just mentioned, a possibility of real negotiation? That is a big question mark, isn't it?
You just mentioned several countries, all big countries with considerable political gravitas in world affairs, and then you have tiny, somewhat backward, impoverished North Korea. North Korea, which sees itself as the party wielding the proverbial carrot and stick. The ball is always in North Korea's court, as far as I can see, looking at the past 25 years of nuclear diplomacy and the latest UN Security Council resolution. One thorny question arises, which is, what is the life expectancy of nuclear diplomacy and UN Security Council resolutions? In my view, UN Security Council resolutions are somewhat like an individual's New Year resolution. At first, there's great fervor, full compliance even, but after a while, lethargy sets in, non-compliance followed by even blatant violation, and the problem grows. So will this latest toughly worded UN Security Council resolution make any difference, have a positive impact anytime soon?
Right.
It's too soon to tell, but I would say probably not.
Professor Lee always gives us some very interesting analogies, including this time. But of course, this is more frequent, it seems, UN Security Council resolution than the New Year resolution that you just talked about. Let's go to Mr. Zhao for that. So, are we just postponing the realizing moment that we have to do something, and we have to do it without any condition among all parties? Or are we really enjoying ourselves at this point about, the overall unanimous voting for a UN Security Council resolution against the DPRK? Mr. Zhao, from China's perspective.
Right, I think this time is a little different. The new sanctions resolution is not only about words, it does have teeth. It categorically prohibits exports from North Korea of important mineral resources and fishing, etc. That will cut North Korea's overall foreign income by 1/3. So that is going to seriously undermine North Korea's economic health.
If we know the number were correct. I mean,
Right.
3 billion was the number that we assumed that the DPRK has in terms of international trade, and 1/3 would be $1 billion US.
Yeah, and another difference from previous resolutions is that it does not include livelihood loophole, to use the word. So there is no room for so-called flexible interpretation. So it will be, I think, less likely for countries to have disputes about whether the sanctions have been faithfully implemented.
Yeah.
So I think it is going to have a real impact. The issue is countries currently differ about how much they can go in this direction further without destabilizing the North Korean economic system and therefore the political system. The Chinese position is always that we should avoid directly threatening the stability of the regime. But the US is more than happy to see the economic sanctions taking an incremental approach to undermine the regime.
Let's go to another guest before we talk about the China and the US side of it, because there are many bilateral and triangle relationship we're talking about here. Mr. Oh from the Nanyang Technological University, of course, it's amazing that the foreign ministers from all these countries could gather at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. This is such an important platform for this issue. But you have heard from the DPRK after the UN Security Council resolution that it is not, quote, going to put the nuclear weapon issue on the negotiating table, end of quote. So, Mr. Oh, from your perspective, how much danger are we facing right now?
Well, I think during all these years, North Korea has been bent on building their own nuclear weapons. I think they have seen from other examples around the world, once you are in possession of, shall we say, workable nuclear weapons, then the other countries would treat you differently, or in North Korea's opinion, treat you with more respect. So we have seen all these rounds and rounds of sanctions of United Nations Security Council resolutions being passed, and then they might take effect for a short number of time, a short span of time, depending on the willingness of the various UN countries to members to enforce these resolutions. But typically you will go back to square one. North Korea will start testing new, for example, ICBMs in this case, and you would like to impose new sanctions, but it has never been really working.
Mr. Pollack, Chinese side, according to Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, said very clearly, once again, call on all parties to keep calm. But at the same time, we do hear from the U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson talking about the timing of possible negotiation or interaction with DPRK. He said, we will know it when we see it. They're vague in a way about the timing. So, Mr. Pollack, do you think it is a statement made out of frustration because there's no solution? Or is it a statement out of, in fact, not even a little bit of strategy at all?
I think Secretary of State Tillerson has probably leaned farther forward than anyone else in the administration, the Trump administration at this point, not so much on the idea of negotiations again, but of talks, on specific talks as to format, context, and when. That's worthy of note. He's in effect saying to North Korea, you need to do some things, or rather cease to do certain things, and the United States would take that as a possible signal or indicator of whether the atmosphere might permit at least discussions with North Korea. So I think that's a fairly direct signal from Secretary Tillerson. Again, and his statements in a variety of contexts have actually been praised by Chinese officials and the like. But the question is always: does this really reflect a true center of gravity in the Trump administration, and a way ahead? And I think on that, frankly, we have to see, because again, he's being quite explicit. Cessation of missile testing, all missile testing presumably, would be the minimum requirement before the United States would think about any next steps.
Right. Secretary Tillerson did talk about the signs that is to stop the missile tests. He didn't mention about nuclear. He said stop the missile test. But Mr. Pollack, if I could mention
right, there has been no. It's worthy of note. Yeah.
Yes, it is worthy of note. But on the other hand, Mr. Pollack,
it's worthy of note that there has been no nuclear test now in almost a year.
That's true. Mr. Pollack, what do you say when you use the word atmosphere? From Washington's perspective, if let's just put yourself into the shoes of Secretary Tillerson, what exactly would be the atmosphere we are talking about here from the U.S. perspective? Give us some factors that would make up so-called atmosphere.
Well, the most important dimension of what's just happened is the very fact that it was a unanimous UNSC resolution, all members, permanent and otherwise, on the Security Council, preserving that idea that there is a common position on this, if you will. It's the Security Council and
a common position.
Others all against North Korea. North Korea, of course, in its initial response, just a few hours ago, has, of course, not surprisingly, been sharply defiant. In fact, it's very interesting to me that there were 2 or 3 quite specific references criticizing China in North Korea's response. So I think North Korea, in some sense, feels a bit more heat here, but I don't think that they see this as something that requires them to immediately retrench and talk about a different policy.
But you know,
and frankly, North Korea will probably continue to test when they feel the need to test.
Mr. Pollack, let me just do it again, because I'm asking about the U.S. What do you consider as so-called atmosphere? Let's just not assume anything about DPRK. You said common consensus.
Okay.
That's been reached. Okay, what else are the atmosphere that you're talking about?
Well, atmosphere was the word that I used. I don't know that Secretary Tillerson used it as
what
such.
would make up your interpretation?
What the U.S. is but in my own view, there are some in the administration who feel that there is a basis on which you can defer any possible, if you will, a reckoning here. Nobody wants to see a war. There have been some noises, some signals from some parts of the administration that we have to consider all options, but I don't think we are at that point. But the question is the direction of policy and the direction of various activities on the part of all affected states, but particularly looking for signs from North Korea. But again, the United States, to judge by the comments from President Trump, it feels that there is a basis on which the U.S. can mobilize forces to make clear to North Korea the costs of sustaining its weapons program before any real consideration could be given for an alternative direction in U.S. policy.
Okay. Mr. Pollack was also talking about domestic consensus in a way. Mr. Zhao, that is exactly the question I want to put to you. There are countries, United States, South Korea, China, I guess, also included, debates going on in the society, certainly among policymakers, about what to do with this. And there seems to be getting divergently very different views even within our own societies. So what would this mean eventually for a final policy decision for the governments of these countries regarding this? Mr. Zhao.
Well, it certainly means that homework should be done in every country. Given the sharp division in many of the key players in the region, you have mentioned the United States. There were very different voices from CIA director, from the vice president, from the state secretary. So that sends very mixed signal to North Korea. It doesn't help reassuring the North Koreans. In South Korea, for example, there were deep divisions between the progressive party and the more conservative parties. They have fundamental different assumptions about the motivation of North Korean nuclear program, about what to do with it going forward.
That is just facts. I'm asking you, what might be the impact of this policy, very sharp policy differences on the eventual policy decision-making process?
Well, the impact is it really prevents countries from engaging substantively with each other. Countries have difficulty even understanding their own national strategy, let alone to have an accurate understanding about each other's strategy. one reason China has been reluctant to impose more pressure is because China really doesn't understand the logic of American policy of posing more economic pressure. So we have to do more homework in order to better promote mutual understanding.
Okay, if I could just follow up very briefly to you as well. You know, this is only temporary, UN resolution, until another test. Hopefully the other side wouldn't, but we don't know. So what is China going to do? Is China going to be, Mr. Zhao, as some of the Chinese here in our society complaining about, forever pressured by the United States for something that is done wrongly by the DPRK?
I think for the U.S. to further press China to resolve North Korea crisis is going into a dead end. There's really nothing more significantly for China to do. China has already cut all major economic relations with North Korea. I think we are reaching a point where U.S. has to reflect upon its own strategy. The only option seems to be that engaging with North Korea is the most effective approach to diffuse the tension and to open the door for having a near-term agreement.
Of course, that's what the DPRK wants, to have engagement. But of course, the U.S. has its own conditions, as I said. Let's go to Professor Lee. You know, China, South Korea, even though you are based in the United States, but still you do a lot of research about South Korea, have these ultimate differences as well. Even though the two countries are agreeing with one another, there should be engagement, but there is the THAAD system, and South Korea has promised the United States to fully implement, deploy the whole overall THAAD system. That's going to be a violation of China's, what they consider as its rights and also a sovereignty issue. So, Professor Lee, what do you think about these dramatically different opinions on something important among these countries, between South Korea and China, for example? Will things get worse?
You know, in Asian culture, of course, atmosphere or atmospherics are very important. And Chairman Mao mentioned in 1968 and 1969 when Richard Nixon, campaigning for the presidency and upon becoming president, would say that he wants to bring China out of its isolation into the international community. Chairman Mao was dismissive and said that that's just atmospherics. Atmospherics changed to substance when there emerged a common interest, namely in the form of the common threat of the Soviet Union, which paved the way for talks between China and the United States. From South Korea's point of view, from a nationalistic point of view, THAAD is essential, not in deterring North Korea's ICBM launches, but in North Korea's short-range and mid-range launches. From China's point of view, THAAD is anathema because apparently THAAD can enable South Korea and the US to monitor activities inside China. There is no convergence yet of national interest between South Korea and China on the issue of THAAD, or even North Korea. That will happen only when the carrying cost of continuing to support North Korea for Seoul and Beijing becomes just too costly. Only when the US sees North Korea as an imminent critical threat and is willing to either abandon South Korea or take military action risking war, only then will there be any change. For now, it will be the same old story of North Korean provocations, negotiations and concessions. And as you just now mentioned, yes, there will be another provocation, maybe a nuclear test, another ICBM test, and then what? Have another UN Security Council resolution? These resolutions are tough on paper, but they're not self-executing. Nation states have to fully implement them, and that's very hard. So in the short term, North Korea will remain undeterred.
I see. Mr. Oh, before we go, about 30 seconds left for you. This is taking place in such an unusual platform, ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. What do you think this said about the parties' reluctance to look at each other and talk to one another, and yet eventually come together?
Well, I think the North Korea issue has never been really a serious concern for ASEAN, simply because of the distance, the long distance between North Korea and these countries. But I also don't think all these sort of preconditions and good atmosphere and so on, I don't think they are realistic in terms of expecting North Korea to accede to them, because I think North Korea is really bent on building their own nuclear weapons and deployable nuclear weapons. So either you give them some sort of incentive for abandoning doing so, for example, some sort of economic engagement, or you let them proceed with the deployment of such nuclear weapons, or you have to engage in war. So you need to make clear choices. You cannot be ambiguous about it, whether it's peace or war,
Right.
or you let them go forward.